Hey guys, how would you like to hang out with me, my friends from Ward Radio, The Stick of Joseph, Greg Mattson, and a bunch of other podcasters on the Wavemakers Cruise to Mexico this November 15th through the 22nd? We're going to be doing live events, meet and greets, and all of this while having a blast in Mexico. The details are on goanddotravel.com and use code ThoughtfulFaith for a discounted rate. There's only two areas in the world where Latter-day Saint missionaries can't go. And those are countries that are run either by communists or by Muslims. And so a Latter-day Saint, like me, I look at that and I say, what gives here? Why do you guys refuse to allow us the religious liberty that we're willing to allow you? So the other day, I had a great conversation with Dr. Khalil Andani. Dr. Andani holds a PhD from Harvard in Islamic Studies and currently teaches religion at Augustana College. Dr. Andani is an intellectual historian and a Muslim philosopher of religion who engages in public conversations and debates about the nature of theism generally and Islam specifically. His latest publication is called Allah, the Unconditioned Reality, and presents a new philosophical argument for metaphysical monotheism. Dr. Andani is also part of an interesting sect of Islam known as Ismaili Islam. It's a branch of the Shia tradition, and this form of Islam holds that today there is a living descendant of Muhammad that acts as the living guide for the people of God on earth. In this conversation, we explore some of the questions that people have about Islam. I hope you enjoy it. Dr. Khalil Andani, welcome to Thoughtful Faith. Great to have you here.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be invited here.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump right into this. What is Islam?
Well, I'm glad you asked. And before I answer, I'll just say that I don't know if you remember, but I did reach out to you to have a discussion like this via a YouTube comment because our mutual acquaintance, Cameron Bertuzzi, as of late, has been comparing Mormonism and Islam, right?
Yes.
And our two traditions are sort of at the receiving end of his polemic. So I was like, and then you made I thought you made a really good response video to him. It was about like God having body parts or something. And you responded from a Mormon perspective, but you defended Islam a little bit there as well. And I was like, wait a minute, like I should just talk to this guy. We're both sort of on the receiving end. And so we might as well just have our own chat. So thank you for having me. So let me just begin. So I'll answer your question first descriptively, that is in my academic capacity as a religion professor, which I do this every semester with my students of various religions. So Islam, put it briefly, is a religious tradition. Historically speaking, it was founded by a man known as the Prophet Muhammad, who lived in the early 600s. And in brief, this is a religious tradition that is monotheistic and understands itself not as a new religion, but as a continuation or a restoration of a perennial religion of sorts, of a perennial monotheism that has been taught by many messengers of God in the past, reached its final manifestation or articulation through the mission of Muhammad, who lived in the 10th century. Historically speaking, what we call Islam today is not one community or even one creed. It is an umbrella of numerous communities, all of whom identify as Muslim, all of whom believe that Muhammad was the final messenger of God who preached monotheism. But after those two facts, monotheism and the mission of Muhammad, communities that identify as Muslim greatly diverge on almost every issue under the sun. So in Christian language, we could say Islam consists of a multiplicity of denominations, if you want to call them that, or schools of thought, with differences in creed, in theology, in practice, in law, in ethics, in politics. So Islam, from a descriptive perspective, is not a monolith. It is a mosaic of multiple mutually contradictory traditions.
Sounds like that happens somewhat in Christianity as well. I will say though that so within Islam, if I understand it properly, there are the two divisions within Islam. The main ones, right? Kind of like within Christianity, there's sort of the Protestant Catholic divide. That's kind of the primary one in Christianity. That within Islam, there is the Sunni division, and then there's this Shia division with about, is it roughly like 80% or so are Sunni? Is that correct? Roughly?
Yeah, today 80% are Sunni and 20% are Shia. But what we need to realize is that the Sunni Shia division, it started, i.e., the first seeds of that division started on the death of Muhammad. Like the first seeds of that.
Yeah, because it was about it was all about the succession.
Yes, it was about succession. So you have an initial seeds of division when Muhammad passes away, because the first issue was who takes over the leadership of the community of believers after Muhammad. And this is a key issue because Muhammad functioned as not merely a messenger, but as a spiritual leader in his own right. He performed many intercessory, religious, spiritual duties in his own time for his community. So being the messenger of God also means that Muhammad is the chief interpreter of that message. He's not someone who just proclaims things and then goes home. He proclaims what Muslims see as revelations from God, and that would include the Quran, for example. But Muhammad also taught the meaning, the implementation of those revelations. So he's also the fountainhead of what you would call proper interpretation or proper exegesis. And he's also a political leader in his own time, and he's also an intercessor. Some of the functions that Muhammad performs for his community are very similar to the functions of the Christian priest or bishop, like intercessory roles, purification roles. So we're talking about a man who played a major role, and then when he passes away, there's immediately a contestation over, well, who takes over these leadership roles? Muslims believe that there are no more prophets after Muhammad, but they all believe that there has to be some form of divinely legitimate leadership after Muhammad, and then they disagree on who those leaders are, what the qualifications are, how they should be appointed, and that is what differentiates Sunni and Shia. But it gets worse, in this sense that the Sunni subdivide into multiple schools of law and theology and also mysticism. Because in Sunni Islam, there is no directly divinely appointed leader after Muhammad. In Sunni Islam, the community has some authority to follow the leaders that it wants to follow on different issues, and because the community never agrees on anything, you have many leaders, i.e. imams, many imams in the Sunni tradition.
So it was funny. I listened to another episode where you talked about this very issue, and I was like, hold on, I see where this is going. The Sunnis are essentially, and I know it's not exact, but I'm going to give the analogous in my mind is they're the Protestants of the Islamic movement, because they don't have a centralized leader that acts as the authoritative interpretive body that gets to make the binding decisions on the community. And so they divide and subdivide based on different Islamic scholars who act as the equivalent of what I would look at as like pastors. Pastors are these people that gather a group around them based on their interpretation of the Bible, and they create their own churches that then end up disagreeing with all the other churches. And so within Sunni Islam, you have Islamic scholars who are like a pastor, who then interpret the scriptures in a particular way, create followings, and then that subdivides and subdivides. But Shia is interesting. I didn't know this, and you're really interesting because I know that you're part of a Shia kind of subgroup, which I find really fascinating, by the way. But you guys approach the problem of authoritative ecclesiology different, right? Latter-day Saints understand, because we're big on there's a central authority that God has ordained to make the authoritative decisions on earth for how to guide the people of God, right? And the Shia, that's their belief, is that such a imam exists, right? Now, for some of them, like the Shia that are in Iran, they're called Twelvers, is that it? And they believe that there was at one time this authoritative person, but that then died off. But you actually are part of a group that believes that there is today a living imam who is the infallible interpreter of the Quran. Is that correct?
Yes, generally speaking, that is correct. I always try to be careful when people make these analogies of Shia and Catholics and Protestants and Sunnis. It does work to a certain degree. It works to a certain
Yeah.
degree until you have what we'll later mention, until the Salafi movement in Sunni Islam comes along, which is like more Protestant in a sense. So basically, you could see that the Sunnis are a little bit analogous to Protestants, but the Sunnis have much more respect for scholarly traditions. So it's as if in the Protestant world, not only do you have a pastor, but you have like pastors who are following the school of thought founded by like a pastor who lived 1,000 years ago, for example.
Well, I mean, I guess you could say that. You think like Lutherans or
Yeah, in a
Calvinists,
sense. In a sense,
right?
in a sense. Of course, the other issue is, the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Anglicans, they broke off from a main body, so to say, right? Whereas in Islam, although Sunnis like to imagine that they're the main body and that the Shia broke off from them, in Islam, in the beginning, when Muhammad dies, there is no main body. There's just a scattering of multiple groups who all believe different things. The Shia were very early, and they're one of them, and there's all these other groups. And to make a long story short, there are maybe like 6 or 7 different groups, theological, legal groups, that over 600 years, they amalgamate to form the Sunnis.
Oh, okay.
That's how the
I see what you're
Sunnis come
saying.
to be. So to put an analogy for you, what if at some time you had like 10 Protestant groups all break off, right? And they're all different, but then 500 years later, they become this like Protestant alliance. And they all have communion with one another. That's how the Sunnis actually come to be. And I'm saying this because many Sunnis don't even know this. But many Sunnis imagine that Prophet Muhammad founded the Sunni community, and then the Shia got mad and broke off. But this is just not true. What you instead have is a scattering, a diffusion of many, many groups, and then over the centuries, many of these groups will merge together, and to use Christian terms, they come into communion with one another to form the Sunni communion, or in Islamic terms, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of the tradition and the community. So communion is not even a bad word. So that's the Sunnis. But as you say to what you said otherwise, yes, Shia Muslims generally believe that although Muhammad was the last prophet, meaning Muhammad is the last person to convey news and warnings from God in a particular format, which we call the Quran, he is not the last divine guide. He's not the last divinely inspired human. Shia believe that humans need at all times of history a divinely inspired guide to infallibly interpret God's message, and that this infallible interpretation, broadly speaking, this is like a continuation of Revelation, broadly speaking, right?
Yeah.
Because God is always, in Shia belief, God is always continuously inspiring the intellect of the imam to provide the correct answers to new questions about religion or
And
morals.
by the imam, just to clarify, you don't mean the local imam. You mean the imam who is at the head of what, and I'm using Latter-day Saint sort of jargon. It
Sure.
would be the equivalent of who your prophet is, right? We have
Yeah,
someone
yeah,
who we
I'm aware.
consider a prophet, spirit, revelator.
You guys have like a living prophet,
Correct.
basically,
And
right?
so there's some interesting similarities and differences here. One of the similarities is that there is this central authority figure that we consider as a prophet who can produce new public revelation to the world, could even write new scripture if God so inspired him to do. But we also, what's funny though, is that we don't hold him to be infallible though. We also believe that he could err and that they even have erred. In fact, we reject infallibility wholesale for any human being in any capacity. But regardless of any of that, I think it's really interesting that I do think there's a really interesting connection here with the recognition that you have personally in your practice of Islam for the need for an adjudicating authority over a textual interpretation. I look at it like this. Imagine if the United States, a lot of Christians say, well, the Bible is self-interpreting. And I go, that's like, imagine if somebody said, well, the Constitution is self-interpreting. Like, we don't need the Supreme Court. It self-interprets itself. It's like, no. And so that's one of the reasons I have a lot of respect for Catholics. I have a lot of respect for Shia Islam in the sense that they understand the need that if you don't have a central adjudicating authority, you just get schism and schism and schism and schism because everyone just reinterprets and then they just go off and do their own thing. And eventually it's like the text becomes almost useless in the sense that if everyone's interpretation is equally authoritative and valid, then you just have a mess.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned this because one of the more sort of philosophical arguments that Smiley Shia, my community, historically has brought to the Sunni world, which the Sunnis found very threatening to the point that it was once a policy 1,000 years ago in a Sunni empire to execute Ismailis on the spot. Like, they should just be killed. Women, children, doesn't matter. That you should execute them. That's some of the fatwas or legal opinions from Al-Ghazali, who's a major scholar of the Sunni tradition. He's like the imam of Sunnism in a sense. Ghazali said any Ismaili should be executed as an apostle.
And we had Governor Boggs in Missouri pass an extermination order on the Latter-day Saints. So, hey, high five.
There you go. So we made this argument. This argument was known in Arabic. It's called Taleim, which means authoritative instruction. And the argument basically said, look, number one, do human beings, and of course it was made within an Islamic society, right? It wasn't made to Christians, but it was like, number one, do human beings require a teacher to recognize God and God's guidance for humans? Do we need a teacher or not? And then they would argue that, well, if you say you don't need a teacher, then you are your own teacher. Okay, and if you say you need a teacher, then okay, you move to step 2. But if you deny the teacher, you're implicitly affirming that a teacher is needed. You just appointed yourself. So then, okay, who is the teacher? Right? Can it be should there just be one teacher, or will many teachers do? And the Sunni answer was always, we are fine with multiple teachers. And at this point, the Ismailis would point out that, look, Sunni imams, with a small I now, Sunni imams of law and theology, they all diverge. They all disagree with one another. So to follow one Sunni school of thought with its imam is to go against the others. And that puts the believer in an epistemic stalemate, because it's like you're in a maze and like there's 10 different people claiming to tell you the way out, and you can't follow all 10, and they contradict each other. So what do? You may pick one of the 10, right? Because the Sunni tradition will say, look, all 4 schools of law are legitimate in the eyes of God, and all 5 or however many schools of theology are legitimate in the eyes of God, but they don't agree with each other. They don't even agree on like basic stuff on like when you pray, where can your hands be? Can your hands be at your side? Can they be in front of you? How high can they be? They don't even agree on this stuff. So that puts the believer in a epistemic stalemate, right? Like, you don't know what to do. So how do you break the tie? How do you break this? Well, the only answer to break the tie is if there was an authoritative teacher, right, whose opinion on a matter by divine grace or by divine sanction is always guaranteed to be correct. That's the only way to get out of that stalemate. So the Ismailis presented this argument. And then the last part of the argument was very easy. Okay, so who is that teacher? Now, luckily for our community, the Ismailis, at that time, and now I would say even in this time, if we were to make this argument, how do you find that one teacher? So reason will tell you that there's one authoritative teacher, right? That makes sense. Assume Islam is correct because it's made in an Islamic milieu. So who is it? Well, it just so happens that today, and 1,000 years ago when they first made the argument, there was only one community who actually believed that there was an infallible teacher on earth at all times, and that happened to be the Ismailis, and therefore it follows that it's the teacher, the imam of the Ismailis, who's the one who should be followed. This was, again, this is a very shorthand argument I've given you, but this is what was presented, and the logic of that argument has a lot of parallels with what you've said. It's also parallels with what I've heard other Catholics say recently. Although he's left the church now, Joshua Sijuade, a good friend of mine, a few months ago.
Yeah, me and Josh talked. We talked just before his departure. Actually, he let me know about it like just after our conversation.
He gave a very similar argument. He wrote a good paper a couple years ago, and he said, look, like, what leadership model in a Christian context makes the most sense? And I think he surveyed like community consensus, right? The rule of like more than one, or like the primacy of one, and he gave some good arguments on why the primacy of one teacher or one authority authority, solves all the problems. So I'm surprised that like some of the logic between our Ismaili community, maybe your community and other communities on the need for, one authoritative teacher in every era, there's so much dovetailing here. And for us, this is a living thing. Like maybe you know or you don't know, but just a few months ago, the 49th hereditary imam of the Ismailis, known as Aga Khan, he passed away in February. And in the Ismaili tradition, going all the way back to Muhammad, right? So going all the way back to Muhammad, there is an unbroken hereditary line of imams. And the way that the authority of the imam is passed on is the imam he personally appoints one of his descendants, usually a son, to be the next imam. It's not elected by the community or some political entity, like it's not chosen by an empire or by a mafia or vote. It's the infallible imam appoints the next imam, and that's it. So this just happened with us, where Aga Khan IV passed away in February. And of course, in modern times, to prevent people from interfering in these things, the imam left a sealed will with the name of his successor. And in less than 24 hours, the will was read. And then literally you find out on a Facebook post or on a Twitter, like we find out the next imam on social media. It's just, there's an announcement. The 50th imam has been appointed. Of course, we know who it is. It was the eldest son. So we now follow the 50th imam. And this model of leadership for Ismailis, it is a tried and tested model of leadership. And you have some schisms, but you don't have like a schism every single time an imam passes away. You avoid that.
So here's one quick question about that, because one thing that you've stressed is the need for an infallible source. And I wonder this, because we reject that. Why isn't the most reliable source? Like, for example, I like to use this analogy. If I had the greatest brain surgeon in the world and I needed brain surgery, because he's infallible, just because he's a fallible human being who could make mistakes, he still is the most reliable source. And so it makes perfect sense to follow his guidance. Why is there an insistence on the need for infallibility? And why do you think reliability is not sufficient?
This is a very good question, and this is a question that, interestingly, what you just voiced right now, this is an argument that Sunni Muslims would bring to us. Because in Sunni Islam, the scholar is seen as reliable. So why not follow him? Just like you said, like a brain surgeon is reliable, a physicist is reliable on science. So the main argument that Shia Muslims offered to respond to this, which you may or may not find convincing, but it would be something like this. So let us suppose that the imam appointed by God is not infallible, which means that the imam at any time could teach an error. Likewise, it also means if he's not infallible, the imam can commit a sin, like a misdeed. So if that's possible,
and just to be clear, you guys do believe that the living imam of your tradition is not only infallible, that he also is free from all sin. He's a sinless individual. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, we believe that imams are sinless. The 12 Shia also believe this, and most Muslims believe Prophet Muhammad is sinless. And again, sinless does not mean like they have knowledge of like every single subject of human life. The imam is not expected to know quantum mechanics or advanced AI or whatever. Like, sinless means they cannot commit a moral failing, basically. So yes, that is what we believe. But again, I'm going to answer your question. Of course, I have to give you a theological answer. In other words, a theological answer means that you have to grant me, for the sake of argument, that the imam is appointed by God, right?
I see.
And that he has the mandate from God to guide people. If you don't believe that, which I know you personally don't, but if one didn't believe that, right, then what I'm about to say is not going to have much of a foundation. Right? Yeah. But if you just grant the premise that, okay, let's say this is a human appointed by God, and he's inspired by God. So his thoughts are guided by God, in a sense, right? To put it in Christian terms, we believe that the Holy Spirit is continuously, not abruptly, but the Holy Spirit is continuously sort of whispering in the heart of the imam.
I see.
continuously directing him the right way. So if the imam could utter, there's two problems with this. One is strictly theological, the other one is epistemological. The theological problem would be if the imam is guided by the Holy Spirit and the imam utters a teaching, a religious or moral teaching that's wrong, right, that's contrary to the divine will, it would ultimately mean that God, via whatever the intermediary of the Spirit is, it would mean that God misguided the imam. And that contradicts the idea that God has appointed the imam to guide people. So it would actually be like, it would challenge the quote-unquote infallibility of God. So that's a theological answer to your question.
That makes sense, though.
Of course, we don't have the same theology, so that answer won't work. That won't really make a difference to somebody like you. So here's another way to look at that question, which is it's a great question. It's a question that many of us think about. Let's say the imam is reliable. He has good knowledge, right, which is from God. But, on some religious matters, he just doesn't know, okay? For whatever reason, let's accept that God doesn't inform the imam of everything he needs to know to guide people. So the problem then, we then run into the same problem as before. If the imam makes an error in religious matters or in committing a sin, how do we, the community, how do we discover that error? Who's going to call it out? So in order for that error to be discovered and then corrected, right, it would take someone who is more knowledgeable than the imam to discover
Someone
and correct that error.
Who has a higher level of enlightenment, and that would assume that person, rather than the imam, is the one that we should follow.
Yeah, so let's say there is such a person. So now there's the imam, and there's a guy on top of him who's like the error checker of the imam. Now, is the error checker infallible? If not, then we have to put an error checker imam above him. And then we get, if we keep saying each one is not infallible, you get an infinite regress of fallible imams, which never terminates. As a result, the community has no guarantee at any time that what the imam is telling them, or any of these infinite regress imams are telling them, is correct. You're always going to be in doubt. Is this teaching really true? You have no assurance. And for us, for Shias, that is contrary to divine justice. Divine justice, in our understanding, dictates that if God created humans and God desires or wills or commands humans to follow his guidance, the guidance must be available in an assured way. It can't be left to chance. So an infinite regress of fallible imams will either negate divine justice or the regress will terminate. Again, I'm not talking about a regress in time. I'm talking about an epistemic.
Yeah, no, regress of authorities to the imam that is ultimately going to be infallible.
Yeah, exactly. So the regress, it's actually not a problem to have many teachers in a hierarchy. In the Smiley tradition, we've had this for a long time. We don't have it strictly today. Today, there's the imam and there's us, and we follow him. But in the past, there were many teachers under the imam who were fallible. But the imam who's infallible oversaw the whole process. So the regress must terminate in an infallible imam, and then you're good. Then you can have as many fallible teachers as you want. And today, although it may sound that our tradition, maybe your tradition, you get accused of this is just authoritarianism. You guys are like sheep and you just follow. In our tradition, we're not told to be sheep. We're told that, look, everybody has spiritual potential to become like the imam, in a sense, right? Everybody can reach enlightenment. Everybody can become a spiritual teacher in their own way. Right? People can access, again, I don't know what the Holy Spirit means to you, and we believe in the Holy Spirit, but it's not God. We're not Trinitarians. But in our tradition, everyone can be touched by the Holy Spirit. Right?
Yeah,
the imam always has it.
It would be, there are differences there for sure, but there is definitely a similar notion that we believe that all human beings can receive personal revelation from God, and that is through the Holy Spirit. Now, real quick, I want to pivot a little bit here. Obviously, we've gotten into a little bit of the weeds on the specifics of Ismaili. I'm trying to say it right. The Ismaili tradition within Shia Islam. So we have Shia and Sunni. You're a subdivision within the Shia movement, which is the smaller movement generally. Within the entire movement, though, generally, how would you categorize see, for Latter-day Saints, we're really big on this idea of the plan of salvation. Why does this matter to me at all? What is my destiny and relationship to God? Why does God matter? Why does this religion matter? What is the destiny of, what is the destiny of man and the purpose of our existence of human beings within Islam generally?
So it's hard to say generally because we would have to go into different theologies, okay? But I'll try to answer you. So, in general, according to the Quran, it says this in many verses, the world has been created as a sort of a training or testing ground for human beings. And I'm using the word training ground as opposed to just a test, because when I say the world is a test, people say, well, why does God need to test you? Like, he already knows the answer. He knows who's good and who's bad. This makes no sense. So I'm saying training ground, which is what some scholars have said. So it's almost like the world has been created to facilitate spiritual growth and spiritual merit of the creatures that God has created. Like, we have come here to better ourselves, to attain something morally, ethically, spiritually, to become creatures whose entire existence is submitted to God. And that's what the word Islam means etymologically. The word Islam means to surrender or to submit to God, and the word Muslim means one who submits to God. And that's how the word is used throughout the Quran. And from this very broad perspective, Christians and Jews, and you guys as well, many Hindus, many people are Muslim in the broader sense. In fact, the whole cosmos is Muslim. Like, everything obeys the laws of nature. God is continuously creating and sustaining nature and its laws. So technically, the whole universe is Muslim in the broader sense. But humans are interesting. Humans have what we call free will, not necessarily libertarian free will, but we have more agency. We have the ability to actualize more states of ontological possibility than, say, a dog or a cat, right? Or a rock. Like, you take a rock can just be one way, really, right? Humans have this freedom. We have more degrees of freedom to be different ways, and some of the ways that we could live, some of the ways of being human, are contrary to God's will or God's command, which is just bad for us. And other ways of being human are in line with God's command, which is just better for us. So we have these degrees of freedom, but the ultimate purpose is for humans to come into complete harmony with God.
So, and I guess, and maybe this is a theological question I have for anyone that holds to, I know some of the ideas, at least in my understanding, and just so you're aware and others are aware, I actually have read the Quran cover to cover. I have read a couple of books about the hadiths. I haven't actually read the hadiths themselves, but I have an understanding of the life of Muhammad and some of that. And one of the things about Islam, I had a little bit of trouble. And I have the same trouble with some of the creedal traditions that hold to sort of a hard metaphysical monotheism, radical notions of omnipotence, around this notion of, why does God need any of this to bring us into right relationship with him if he created us? Why isn't it that God couldn't just create the Garden of Eden and that's it forever? We all live in paradise forever in a perfect union with one another and God. Like, there seems to be something that is causing God to have to do something, to create this world with problems and evil and all of that. And I guess I wonder, what is sort of the Islamic answer to why doesn't God just get to the end without all the rest of the stuff in the middle if he's all powerful, if that makes sense?
It's a great question. I can't give you one answer because different schools of Islamic theology will have a different answer for you. So I'm going to try to give you four. Let me see if I can give you four answers. So very quickly, right? Like super speed.
How about this?
Group one.
How about this? What if you give me yours? I'd be very interested in hearing the way you would approach it. I will
give you mine, but I feel like I have an academic responsibility to say more than my own, so I'll try to be quick. Group one, Mu'tazilis, group of Muslims, believe in divine justice. They would answer this question very briefly, that all of this, God creating humans, humans committing sins, and then repenting, the Mu'tazilis would say that God is obligated to create the most good, okay? They would argue, I don't know their sub-arguments, but they would argue that creating all this and having humans sin and then repent and this whole growth process, the Mu'tazilis would argue that this is a greater good than God just creating, everybody perfect. That's what they would argue. How do they justify that? I don't know. I haven't gone into that detail, but the gist of their argument would be God is morally obligated to do the best, and this is the best. That's what they would say. Another group, next group, the Asharis. Okay, Asharis are Sunnis. theological school, they emphasize, and there may be exceptions to this because traditions evolve, but they emphasize the sort of divine omnipotence and the absolute freedom, like libertarian freedom of the divine will. So many usheries will say that, you know what, this is what God willed, and we can't get beyond that. We cannot go beyond that. We just know that like God's will.
Sound like Calvinists.
Yeah. So some usheries
Sound
will
like the
say that.
Muslim version of the Calvinists.
Yeah. Now, some other usheries, somebody like Ghazali, and you can read about this in English, Ghazali will claim that this is the best possible world. I don't know how he will justify that, but he will say that God must do the best, and this is the best. That's what Ghazali would say. Let's move on to another tradition, Sufis. These are mystics, Muslim mystics. Majority of Muslims over the last 1,000 years have been Sufi in some way. Like Islamic mysticism is very popular. It's all over Islamic culture. It's all over the internet. The Sufis will say that this whole creation, which by the way includes more than the physical world, God created spiritual realms and the physical world, and there's all these worlds in the middle. Why is he doing all this? The Sufis will say that the very infinitude of God and the very perfection of God necessitates that God's qualities become manifest, i.e. become reflected in lower levels of reality. So the full infinity, you could say the infinitude of God and his attributes can be showcased. So without creation, according to Sufis, God would remain perfect in himself and infinite in himself, but without creation, God would not be fully revealed. And the only way for God to reveal all of his perfections and all of the sort of the infinite perfections that are latent in his essence, the only way for God to show that is by creating lower and lower levels of perfection. That's what the Sufis will say. Next is my group. In the Ismaili view, God directly did create a perfect creation. That's not this world, though. The first creation that God created, and this is first in a ontological sense, not in a temporal sense. The first creation is actually eternal, according to us. So God eternally generated a perfect creation, which we call the universal intellect. And it is in a state of complete bliss, complete perfection, and all the perfections that humans associate with God, like perfect goodness and perfect knowledge, perfect power, it's all in the first creation. And for us, you have a point. God should be able to create perfection right away without all this work, and he did. And this perfect creation, as part of its perfection, it has the ability to create something as well. But because the perfect creation is not God, the perfect creation could not create another perfect creation. It can create something second best. So it did. So now we have God, we have the perfect creation, which is creature number one, and then we have the second creation. That second creation is not perfect because it wasn't directly created by God. It was created by... No, the second creation is called the universal soul. It's a demiurge. And that second creation created this world. And the reason why this world is not perfect is because the second creation is not perfect, but it wants to be perfect. The second creation, he or she wants to be perfect. Like it wants to grow. So it created the best thing that it could, which is this world, and all these great souls that come to this world. And as our souls, as humans, as we grow, as we become more perfect, the second creation gets asymptotically closer and closer to its own perfection. So from our perspective, this world is not the direct creation of God. It's the creation of the universal soul, which is a demiurge, which is a second creation. It's a benevolent demiurge. It's not an evil demiurge. It's a good demiurge. This world and all the stuff that goes on in this world, all of our spiritual journeys, it doesn't matter what religion you are, all of our journeys, your growth, my kids' growth, all of our growth is, in the grand scheme, contributing to the journey toward perfection of that demiurge. And that's why
fascinating.
This world is the way it is. And
Well,
ultimately,
I can
if
tell
you
you this
follow
right
the
now.
logic,
Oh, you go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, if you follow the logic of what I'm saying, this view actually entails universalism, i.e., every soul will eventually reunite with the universal soul as perfected.
That's really interesting. So one thing that is obviously abundantly clear here, trying to talk about Islam is when you drill beyond kind of a really surface level, is kind of like talking about Christianity without drilling into all the different levels of what it is. So there's an enormous amount of diversity here. Now, with that in mind, there are, I think, and this is where I want to kind of take this for this last portion of this conversation, just kind of this basic overview of Islam, is that, let me just summarize and see if I've understood so far. In general, within Islam, the idea is that we are trying to seek some sort of a right relationship with God, and that is achieved through these practices and living according to what is taught, for example, in the Quran. Correct? Is that
and soul building,
trending?
like virtue
And soul building through the experiences of our life. All right. One thing that and people have questions about, there are a lot of practices in Islam that I look at from the outside, and and people can look at some of the things that we do, like Latter-day Saints, we don't drink coffee, for example. And some people are like, that's really weird and arbitrary. And it's like, well, Muslims don't eat pork. So, and I'm interested actually in hearing, for example, with some of these practices, like why do some of these practices exist? Are they just an arbitrary test that God has given you and said, just don't eat bacon? Or is it like how would you describe that to someone that asks why can't Muslims eat pork? Or why do they have to wear certain sorts of attire or whatever? Let's just start with the pork one though. Like, why is that?
So I can't speak on the reasoning that the Sunnis may give. I haven't researched it from their perspective. From an Ismaili perspective, this question was posed to our imam about 70, 80 years ago. And the imam told us in an authoritative pronouncement that eating pork will lead to animalistic qualities within a human being. That's what he said. That's actually the first time, and this was like in the 1950s or something, that's the first time I ever saw anybody answer that question. Like, why? Why is it forbidden? Other answers from other Muslims will often revolve around lack of sanitation or pigs being dirty or something like that. But the answer within our tradition is what I just said. Now, there's something to this. In the Ismaili tradition, as well as other esoteric traditions of Islam, it is believed that humans have a soul, but animals also have souls. They just have like a different kind of soul, and plants have souls. And actually, when animals ingest plants, the plant soul merges with that animal soul. And then when humans ingest animals, the animal soul merges with your human soul. There's like some metaphysical dimension to eating, actually. So the answer that Aga Khan IV gave, that eating pork leads to animalistic qualities within man, it's very much in line with this metaphysical notion of food, of different levels of soul. But this is definitely not a sort of a scientific answer or anything like that. And this answer it's acceptable to Ismailis because Ismailis believe the Imam has divine wisdom. It's definitely not an answer that a non-Ismaili would accept or maybe even take seriously. So some practice, like I would say in general, every rule or religious practice, especially from an Ismaili perspective, all of this has been ordered with some spiritual goal in mind, and sometimes not even a spiritual goal, but a material goal, because Islam is not just about spiritual well-being, it's also about material well-being. Like, we have this idea that humans should live a good quality of life. So some rules are there to promote a better quality of life within a particular time. Some rules are there to facilitate the purification and the growth of the human soul. Another, maybe, I think you guys would agree with us on this, no drinking alcohol.
Yes.
For us, alcohol, not only does it damage the brain, but it damages the soul.
Yes, because I would agree there, 100%.
The embodied human soul, to develop its faculty of rationality while it's in the body, it needs the brain to do that. And once the brain becomes inhibited, the human embodied soul is unable to exercise its rational faculties as effectively as it should. And in fact, a human soul that has impeded rational faculties due to brain impediment will actually start devolving, in a sense. Mm-hmm. It'll become less rational. So for us, the ban on alcohol, and alcohol is forbidden for Ismailis and for all Muslims generally, there's a spiritual reason for that.
And
what you should know, though, don't know this, is Muslim societies in the past were still rampant with alcohol. A lot of people would drink the court elites would drink, the sultans would drink, the caliphs would drink. There are wine glasses with prayers written on them. Like, it sounds very Puritan, and from a normative perspective, it is. But from a civilizational perspective, alcohol was being imbibed in many, many Muslim societies. And actually, today's situation is a bit more unique, where in many Muslim majority nations, like, alcohol is banned completely, and that's actually a little bit unprecedented compared to pre-modern Muslims.
Well, and this is something, and to kind of shift a little bit here as we get into the final stretch of this, I want to talk a little bit about, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, maybe some of the concerns that I have with Islam. Now, it's tough because when I say concerns about Islam, like, we both have concerns about certain types of Islam. In fact, we both have concerns about certain types of Christianity. Like, agreed. But I would say that within Islam, there seem to be issues that I think that can be more prevalent and that are more troubling to me. For example, there's only 2 areas in the world where Latter-day Saint missionaries can't go. And those are countries that are run either by communists or by Muslims. And Muslim countries won't allow our missionaries in. Now, Latter-day Saints are happy to allow Muslims. In fact, we settle Muslim refugees in Utah all the time. That's like a kind of a bit of a scandal amongst some people because of a lot of Muslim immigrants. And so a Latter-day Saint, like me, I look at that and I say, well, what gives here? Why do you guys refuse to allow us the religious liberty that we're willing to allow you?
Do you have particular countries in mind when you say this?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, any Muslim. I don't think there's any Muslim majority countries where Latter-day Saints are allowed to proselyte.
Okay, so there are layers to answer this question. So there are multiple layers, and let me be clear. Personally, like, if I ran a country, I would allow full freedom of religion. And there are many Muslims who think this way, okay? There are many Muslims. There are Pew surveys where they ask Muslims, do you believe in freedom of religion? Majorities always say yes, okay?
And by the way, I recognize that those groups exist, and frankly, I'm over here cheering for you guys. Like, come on, you guys. Like, I want you guys to become the dominant force, because I think that your versions of Islam are closer genuinely to God. And I think you would agree that you're hopefully are closer to God than these groups that are more restrictive like.
But here's the thing. Historically speaking, in Muslim societies and in Christian societies, and I would say this goes for any society where the imperial ruler sponsored a religion. So, for example, in most societies, there was, quote unquote, an official religion of the state or of the kingdom. Like most of these pre-modern European states, it's Christianity. It's some form of Christianity. It could be Catholic, like all these papal states, could be Protestant. And what we need to realize is, in pre-modern times, okay, before what we call secular societies, which is a very new thing, okay, in pre-modern times, there's a distinction between personal belief and public religion. Here's the distinction. Citizenship in pre-modern Muslim and Christian polities, citizenship was articulated in religious terms. So, for example, if you lived in a Christian society, and you can look up what Thomas Aquinas says about apostates, okay? So, if you live in a Christian society, you are automatically assumed to be a Christian, okay? Unless you are part of what you call a recognized protected minority, in which case you're assumed to be of that minority. But if you're like a general member of that society, in a Christian society, you're assumed to be Christian. Now, if someone who grows up in a Christian society, this is until very recently, if you publicly renounced Christianity, you would be seen as an apostate who has committed treason, because your citizenship in the society was articulated in the form of public religious affiliation, if that makes sense. Same thing in pre-modern Muslim society, same idea. If you grew up as a Muslim, that's sort of also your citizenship. And if you publicly said, I'm not a Muslim anymore, I'm atheist, or I'm Christian, or I'm whatever, it's almost like you're publicly renouncing your allegiance to that ruler, to that kingdom.
But could I make a distinction that I think is important within Christianity that I don't know exists in Islam? And this is one of the things that is tough for me as I look at Islam and try and understand it, is within Islam, there is within the person of Christ this idea of, my kingdom is not of this world. And us as Latter-day Saints, we would say the biggest problem that ever happened to Christianity was that it was adopted by the state. Like, that's the worst possible thing that happened to Christianity. And Christianity, I think, inherently is supposed to be sort of something outside of the state. And there is, I think, legs for a separation between church and state within Christianity itself. in my reading of the Quran, and I'm not a scholar and I'm not as much as you, I don't see that sort of thing. It seems very much that Sharia law is meant to be the law of the land that governs the people of God politically through the force of the state.
But can you tell me, where does the Quran says almost nothing about statecraft, actually. Like,
Well,
the concept of a state is not in the Quran. Like,
well,
it's not there.
maybe you're right, and maybe you're right. So how would you, something like Sharia law is something
let's just
that
pause there. Sharia
I just look at.
Sharia
Well, I guess
law
let me
is
let
a
me say
bit
this.
of a misnomer.
What is the nature, and I'm not to debate this, it's more just that I
Yeah.
want to get clarification in your view. What is the nature of the separation between church and state within Islam?
Sure. So, but before I will answer this, but what you need to know is that the Christian world did not arrive at the separation of church and state until very recently.
I agree.
Until in the
And
last
Latter-day Saints, by the way,
like
Latter-day
200
Saints are like, we think that is just so you know, we think all of the Christianity for 1800
Right.
years was in a state of apostasy. And guess what? That's the biggest reason why. The biggest,
No,
the great
I guess,
apostasy was, in our view, essentially a state hijacking of the Christian movement.
but nobody believed in the separation, like in this terms, the terms that you're using, which these are very American. This is very American lingo. The thing
Oh,
is,
100%.
world history didn't start 300 years ago, right? It just
Agreed.
didn't. So
100%.
nobody believed in this. The Europeans didn't believe in this. Christians didn't believe in this. Buddhists did not believe in this. Muslims
Agreed.
didn't believe in this. So in your terms, this is a very new thing. This is now sort of being forced, in a sense, on the rest of the world. Now, what I will say is that in Islamic history, okay, I'm not going to use church and state, because those are the wrong, we don't have these categories in Islam. But there was a separation between personal religious law, Sharia, and state law, siyasa. There was a separation. There was also an intersection between the two on certain matters. Let me explain. Sharia, firstly, the term Sharia law is a complete misnomer, and Americans and others should just stop using those terms, because the word Sharia, if you translate it as law, you could translate it as Islamic law. So you're saying, what about Islamic law? Like, it sounds silly. So there's no such thing as Sharia law. Secondly, Sharia has never actually, until modern times, Sharia was never actually the law of a country or a kingdom. Sharia refers to the idea that God has given a set of rules and principles for individual humans to live so as to fulfill our duties to God. So Muslims, for example, following Sharia for Muslims means not drinking alcohol, praying the right number of times a day, not stealing from people, not lying to people, not gossiping. This is all part of Sharia, actually. Basically, Sharia means a way of life oriented toward piety before God. That's what Sharia actually is, and that's how the Quran
And I guess, and maybe you can help me understand this. 'Cause when like in the Quran itself, there are things like it's Jizya, jizya. Is that how do you say that word? The tax?
Jizya. Sure.
The jizya. Yeah, the jizya.
Yeah.
So there is we say it's not involved in statecraft, yet those who are not Muslims, who are living within the Muslim community, are required to pay a special tax by divine fiat to the Muslim community. Now, I don't have a...
Think about that.
Go ahead.
The Quran,
Go ahead. What are your thoughts on that?
But the Quran is not a constitution, right? The Quran, although you read it as a book, it's not a comparable to the U.S. Constitution. It's not a document for the founding of a state. The Quran is like the printout of 23 years of Google Maps. I'll repeat that.
Yeah, go ahead. Explain what you mean by that.
The Quran. So, have you ever used Google Maps? I'm sure you do. Right? I use it all the time. So, you ever put on audio mode, like, because you can't look at the screen?
Yeah,
like, okay, so you're driving, and then you pick a destination. You're like, I want to go here, and then you drive for an hour, and as you need to be told where to go, it'll say turn right, turn left. That's what Google Maps does. That's how the Quran functioned when Muhammad was alive for 20 years.
By the way, I love that analogy. Having read the Quran, that was one of my takeaways of it, is the way that you actually read it, is that it comes across as very like, here are a bunch of things that you're supposed to do and what you need to do. It does sound more like a Google Maps than a narrative.
Every verse of the Quran was originally proclaimed by Muhammad in a Google Maps situation, except instead of a physical destination, you have a spiritual destination. But remember, in Google Maps, when the bridge closes, what does it the maps do? Like, let's say like you're at the thing, yeah, reroutes you, right? So something happens there, and then the maps gives you the direction that you need at that moment. At that moment. So some of the stuff in the Quran, which sounds political to you, that was guidance given to the Muslim community in the year 630 in response to a political situation in the year 630. The verse you're citing.
Yeah, it's a particular, and we would do this as well, where we will say that there are certain commandments or whatever that were given for a particular time for a particular set of circumstances.
Because I can tell you, based on the scholarship, we know when that verse was revealed. The verse you cited about fighting a subset of Christians, for example, until they pay the jizya. Why does that mean now Muslims should go conquer the whole world at all times? No, it doesn't actually mean that, because that verse was revealed when the Byzantine Empire is active. The Byzantines had a victory over the Persians. They were expanding. There was news they were expanding into Arabia. And jizya, what the Quran calls jizya, this means tribute tax. So a tribute tax is a tax paid by a conquered people, okay, to the superior power in exchange for protection and freedom of religion. That's what a tribute tax is. They already existed. The Byzantines and the Sasanians, they were already charging jizya on minority religious groups. In fact, many Coptic Christians were quite unhappy about the type of taxes they had to pay to the Byzantines, because the Nestorians were. So jizya is just a pre-modern type of tribute tax, okay? And the Quran mentions it because that verse is in response to a reported Byzantine invasion of Arabia. So now Muhammad's community has to go fight against them. Islam is not a pacifist religion. The Quran allows defensive warfare. It does. And I would challenge anyone, we can go through the entire Quran. The only type of war that the Quran justifies as like morally valid is defensive war. It doesn't actually allow offensive war. Now, here's what happened in Islamic civilization, very similar to your story, okay? The Christian story. After Muhammad dies, his political successors, who are recognized by Sunnis as legitimate successors, they transform the Islamic community into a sort of empire. Now, it's not necessarily their fault, because the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires were literally next door to Muhammad's community. So that was going to happen. Perhaps it was going to happen anyway. But the point is, the Muslim community comes into contact with the Byzantines and the Sasanians, and either the Byzantines are going to conquer them or they're going to beat the Byzantines and the Sasanians. And for whatever reason, some Muslims see this as divine providence. The Muslim community defeated both empires. The entire Sasanian empire gone. So now, 100 years after Muhammad's death, the Islamic community is now an empire. And empires need to have governing policies, and one of the policies they had to give religious minorities freedom was a tribute tax. But remember, Muslims have their own taxes to pay to the Muslim ruler. The minorities don't pay Muslim zakat or other types of taxes. They pay the tribute tax. What you should know, though, is and my dates might be a bit off, I believe sometime in the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire, which is a Sunni caliphate, they abolished jizya. No more jizya. So jizya doesn't exist today. I don't know any Muslim majority country that charges jizya, because Muslims generally have recognized that something like jizya is a type of taxation form that belongs to the age of empires. It doesn't belong to the era of nation states. And just to add to that, Muhammad and the Quran do not allow offensive war. They don't. And there's good scholarship on this. But guess what? 100 years after Muhammad, the Islamic empires, they all believe in offensive war. Because everybody else did, all the empires. But today, and this is something you should take to heart, and this should allay some of your fears, today, the official position of all Muslims, except for the very small number of extremist groups, okay? But the official position of all Muslims is that because we live in a modern world of nation states which have peace treaties, offensive war is not allowed. It's not permissible.
And so I guess sort of to kind of wrap some of this up, I appreciate that so much. One of the things that I believe, I would say probably my number one concern as a Latter-day Saint is the fact that our missionaries are not allowed into Muslim countries. And I really wish that they were, and that there were more religious liberty within the Islamic communities. That is something that does concern me. And the fact that you and other Muslims like you believe in religious liberty, that is the thing that of all the things going on with Islam, like that's the thing that I hope can happen. And by the way, that's a two-way street. Like, you guys want to come and teach us about Islam? Like, I have you on my program. Like, I want Latter-day Saints to learn about Islam. And I hope that Muslims will want to learn about us. Because I actually believe that when people, let the cards fall where they may. If people are going to believe what they're going to believe, but I don't believe in this because it's a Western value. I believe because this is an actual divine value. I believe it's a moral truth that people should be free. And to be truly free, you have to be free to hear ideas from other people, even those that you disagree with. And so I'm cheering on all of the people within the Muslim community that are hopefully opening those kinds of doors to greater levels of liberty, of ideas within all Islamic communities. And I think that there's a lot of progress being made in that area.
Well, interestingly, the Quran agrees with what you just said on religious liberty. There are multiple verses of the Quran that promote religious liberty, and the Quran in the 7th century is quite a revolutionary document for this reason, among others. The very famous verse that Muslims today love to cite, which says, quote, "There is no compulsion in religion.
Yes.
Truth stands out clear from falsehood." Another verse says, "Let whoever wills believe, and let whoever wills not believe." So there's nothing in the Quran that supports forcing people to become a particular religion. In fact, the earliest forms of battle that Muhammad's community had to fight was against religious persecution, or fitna. Like, the Quran says, actually, one of the reasons that justifies warfare is if a group is being religiously persecuted, which includes Jews and Christians. For example, there's a verse in the Quran that says Muslims should defend churches and temples and synagogues if those places are under attack. So the Quran agrees with you. I agree with you personally, and many Muslims agree with that. But let me get back to the problem that you've cited, right? So then why are all these Muslim countries not allowing Christian missionaries? So again, there are different layers. I already shared one layer. There is a legacy where religious affiliation is tied to political allegiance, and that aura, that sense, does still exist in many places in the world. So that's one reason, okay? But there are other reasons. Nihilism. Whether you intend or not, remember, almost all the Muslim world in the 1800s and 1700 to World War II, the entire Muslim world was colonized by Europe, by the British, by the French, by the Dutch, by the Germans, and then post-World War II, and you can check this out. I can't name the country because I don't want to get in trouble, but let's just say a certain North American country has intervened in many Muslim majority places, okay? Not with the best intentions all the time. So many Muslim countries, their leadership and their people, when they see a bunch of Christian missionaries coming, because if you've read about how Christianity spread,
they have some PTSD.
Yeah, they have PTSD. Even though your group is not there to colonize, right? But when they see you, to them, it just looks like, okay, this Western group is here to colonize us again.
Unfortunately, the tensions are just so high that being there as a Latter-day Saint wouldn't even be safe, simply because of the tensions that already exist in the political sphere, just because you're, But now, I think we're kind of getting down to time here, where we probably better finish up. Let's go ahead and wrap up here. What do you hope that Latter-day Saints watching this know about Islam?
The first thing I would say is to appreciate the internal diversity of Islam. The fact that Islam is a mosaic of many, many different communities, where each community has their own history, their own tradition. And I would hope that Latter-day Saints, and also just Americans generally, do not homogenize Islam. Don't think of Islam as one thing that you can simply figure out by reading the Quran and that's it. Because the Quran is only like the founding text, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's not really a text in the beginning, but let's say the Quran is the founding text, but Islam as a tradition is not just the founding text. It is the entire accumulation of interpretation of that founding text. Just like it would not be responsible for me to say, I want to know about Christianity. I'm only going to read the Bible and that's it. I'm not going to read church history. I'm not going to read the creeds. I'm only going to read the Bible, and then I'm going to put it down, and I know Christianity. If I told that to somebody, they would just say, no, you're nuts. Like, you're not going to learn anything. Or similarly, I want to know what is the United States of America. I only read the Constitution, and that's it. I don't read any of how that Constitution has been interpreted era after era. So with Islam, Islam is not just the Quran. Islam is the Quran plus multiple interpretive traditions. And the last thing I would say for Latter-day Saints is that you really want to learn about Islam, you have to talk to Muslims, like what you're doing. And I apply this rule to all religions. And as a religion professor, this is the first lesson I teach my students. I say, you may be the most anti-religious, atheist, skeptic, and you may say, oh, I want to learn about this religion, but I want to learn objectively. So I'm going to read stuff that are not by people within the religion. I'm only going to read what atheists have to say about Islam. I'm only going to read what Christians have to say about Islam or any other religion. And I say, if you did that, you have an infinite regress of learning what other people outside the religion think of the religion, but you never touched the religion. So you actually have to learn about any religion from its people. Where you will differentiate yourself from a believer in the religion is not your sources, but the questions you ask. So when you learn about a religion, you can learn about it descriptively. In other words, you just want to know, this is what Muslims believe, this is what they do, this is their history, and you don't judge. Or you can learn about it prescriptively, which is where, in this case, as a Muslim myself, I'm learning about Islam because I do want to make judgments. I want to make theological judgments and others. So those are two different ways to learn about religion, and I think all people can learn about any religion descriptively without getting into polemics. And that's what I would encourage your audience. I would say, learn about Islam descriptively. That's it. You don't worry about, am I going to judge it? How am I going to judge? You can do that. There is a way to responsibly make a theological judgment about another religion, but you can't make a theological judgment prior to getting a descriptive understanding of the phenomenon. Like, you have to do the descriptive, then you can do the theology. This is actually a field called comparative theology. I received some training from Francis Clooney, professor at Harvard, who is a Catholic comparative theologian. This is what he taught me. Do the description first. Talk to people like me about Islam. Read some books. Don't just read the Quran. Read stuff after the Quran, right? There's some good Western academic books. Do all that, then make all the judgments you want, because as a person of faith, you are going to make theological judgments. We all do. I'm not saying you can't do that. But don't theologically judge before you learn about the phenomenon. That would be my advice.
I absolutely love that advice. I often say the same thing about us. I say, look, most people, they've just heard what other people have said, what's on South Park, what's on, the Book of Mormon musical or whatever. And it's like, take that time to talk to us instead of just talking about us. And I hope that people do that same with Islam. I hope they do it with all those religions. Find out from the people that are in it. Seek to understand before you start to render those judgments. That's great advice, and I encourage everyone to do it. Dr. Andani, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure and an honor, and it was a lot of fun. You asked very unique questions, and it tells me I need to have more conversations with people of your community.